and welcome to Worlds Apart. A new team of international inspectors arrived in Syria on Tuesday to oversee the destruction of the country's chemical weapons, a Herculean task indeed. In the meantime, questions still remain about when, where, and by whom some of those weapons may have been used. And to try and answer some of them, I'm now joined by Angela Kane, the UN High Representative for Disarmament Affairs. Ms. Kane, I greatly appreciate your being on the show.
Thank you for asking me, Roxana. I'm happy to be here.
Well, I know that your team of experts just wrapped another trip to Syria, and as far as I understand, that trip took them to 6 various neighborhoods where chemical weapons were allegedly used. Now, it seems that this investigation is attracting far less media attention and is certainly being conducted in a rather different geopolitical environment compared to the investigation of the Ghouta incident. I wonder if it was any easier for your colleagues to do their job this time around.
I think what happened is that they were, of course, in Damascus at the time the Ghouta incident happened, and they were investigating the 3 incidents that we had agreed with the Syrian government would be investigated, and that is Khan al-Assal, which happened in March, and 2 additional incidents. And they were investigating those when Ghouta happened. And I had flown to Damascus to ensure that the Syrian government would agree to us investigating as well the Ghouta incident, because that was not part of the agreement we'd earlier made. So they did agree to that. The team deployed to the 2 neighborhoods where chemical weapons were alleged to have been used. And what happened then is that the team was so exhausted after the end of the very 5-6 very intensive days in 40 degrees plus temperatures to go into the rebel-held areas, to interview victims, to visit hospitals, talk to first responders, healthcare workers, visit sites, that it was necessary to really give them a rest, to pull them out. And we promised the Syrian government at the time that they would go back as quickly as possible, which they did. They did the report on the August 21 incident. They went back, wrote the report, and they basically came back. And of course, none of us could have anticipated the dramatic development of the agreement between the Russian Federation and the United States in Geneva. And so the visit now started under very different premises, really, than when they went in the first time.
Now, you mentioned how difficult it was for your colleagues to work on the ground, and I reported extensively from Syria. I actually accompanied UN inspectors several times on the various trips around Damascus and to other cities in Syria, so I can certainly understand how physically demanding and psychologically stressful that can be. But I also would like our viewers to understand that when we talk about the UN investigation, what we actually mean is a group of UN inspectors arriving at any particular site, spending there anywhere between 2 and maybe 5 to 6 hours. And in that very short period of time, they have to inspect the site, they have to collect the samples, they have to talk to the witnesses and survivors. And I'm sure nobody doubts that professionalism, but I have to ask you, how limiting do you think are the time and security constraints on the overall quality of collected evidence?
You are absolutely right, and you've had a first-hand view of it. But what happened is that, first of all, we had to negotiate with the government to have a ceasefire for the time that the team would spend in the field with the rebel-held territories. And then we had to make an agreement with the rebels to basically say, look, we need to talk to victims, we need to talk to first care responders, we need to talk to officials, and we also need the space to do it in. Every single person who was interviewed was filmed, photographed, and all of there were recordings made so that we had a complete case history. And then there was blood drawn, there was hair and urine samples, and also if there was a site that had possible environmental evidence, the team was taken there and they took environmental samples. All of this is detailed, of course, in the report. But what is very important is that there had to be a chain of custody. Now, the chain of custody means that the inspectors or the team, the investigation team, took the samples, took the case history, recorded it all, and made sure that it never left their site. You are right that it was very demanding to do it in a very short time.
As far as I understand, there are absolutely no concerns, no criticism about the chain of custody for these samples this time around. And I know that Syrian officials were accompanying your team all the way to The Hague. But I think there is a lot of criticism with regards to the actual methodology that you just mentioned. And if I can bring up one particular case. I know that in Ghouta, your team had to collect environmental samples in two very different areas, in West Ghouta and in East Ghouta, and you also collected human samples from the survivors that the opposition pre-selected for you. And as it follows from the UN report, which is now in public domain, none of the environmental samples that your team collected in West Ghouta tested positively for sarin, and yet pretty much every human sample that you collected there tested positively. How would you explain this inconsistency? Because it's not addressed in the report, but I'm sure the experts, being the professionals that they are, would have thought about this discrepancy.
I think what we always said is that the team would actually present the facts. And I think the facts are there for everyone to see. They collected, I believe, 30 environmental samples in the Ghouta incident, or incidents, I should say. And also they collected about 80 environmental biomedical samples from the victims and people who had been affected. They did prove that sarin was evident in the samples they found. But on the other hand, if they did not find sarin in the environmental samples, it just testifies to the honesty of the inspections, that they're saying, this is what we found, this is what we took. But on the other hand, what you also pointed out is, yes, they had 4 site visits to the various sites. They did go in 4 different times. But of course, that's only a small area that they covered. So in a way, it was a limited exposure, also time-bound, because you will recall the first day they were under sniper fire. So they had to return, exchange the car, and then went in again, which further curtailed the time. But it wasn't to say it was used on a massive scale. All they found is that it was used, and there was definite positive proof of sarin use.
Can I just specify, how did you reach those conclusions? Because environmental samples are extremely important, and I know that in the report itself, it is stated that on that particular day, August 21st, weather conditions would have maximized the potential impact of chemical weapons use. So sarin, if it was indeed used, would have stayed closer to the ground. It would have penetrated the lower levels of the building. So at least one of the samples, I would assume, I'm not a scientist, of course, would have tested positively, and yet none of the samples, none of them tested positively for sarin. So if you believe that sarin was used in that particular area, you must have relied your judgment on the human samples. Is that right?
No, I basically think that if you read the report comes out and says sarin was used. And it is also a matter that maybe in the environmental samples they took, there was no sarin found, but that doesn't mean that sarin wasn't used. It was there in the human samples. And so I think that when I explained to you is that there was a limited time. If they'd had more time to go around, maybe they would have found different samples. It was a limited collection that they did, but the collection was conclusive. And I think it was very comprehensive. And so therefore, and in the matter of transparency, as you mentioned, we shared all of these samples with the Syrian government. They basically were split when they arrived in The Hague. We facilitated the travel of the Syrian officials to The Hague because we wanted to have a completely transparent process. And that is what the inspectors concluded.
Ms. Kane, I think nobody would actually question the transparency of the whole process or the integrity of the team. But one possible explanation that other scientists have floated would be that all those people that were supposedly, that were telling about how they were sleeping at night and that rocket hit, they were brought actually from a different area, that they were not residents of West Ghouta, but were indeed brought by the opposition to somehow change the flow of that investigation. Is it something to consider? Is it a viable explanation?
I think that is, I think you can put forward any suppositions that you want, but on the other hand, the team did not go into a limited area that was only, let's say, 100 meters by 100 meters. I think they did go to different sites, and I think it is extremely difficult. I mentioned to you that 80 different case studies that they made extensive studies of. And I think it is not possible to say we brought them all in from different areas. To my mind, that is inconceivable. Anyone can come up with a theory, but that does not mean that the theory is correct.
Can I just check it with you, because you obviously have much larger expertise on this issue. Would it have been possible for the sarin to be used and then evaporate in a matter of, say, 5 days? Because certainly we have no reason to doubt the expertise of the team. They would have known how to collect the samples. And I look at the list of samples that they collected, and it's indeed very diverse. I mean, it's a piece of fabric, soil samples, all the various samples that they relied upon. And I think in collecting environmental samples, they had a certain degree of freedom. They could choose whatever they wanted. But when it comes to the access to actual survivors, they didn't have that freedom. Those survivors were, quote unquote, pre-selected by the opposition. So again, is it conceivable that sarin was used in that particular area, but that all the traces evaporated in a matter of a couple of days?
It is scientifically not possible for sarin to evaporate in such a short time. I think, as the report also shows, that the sarin was enriched with stabilizers. And stabilizers actually means that it remains a lot longer in the environment as well as in the human tissue. The pure sarin, for example, evaporates a lot more quickly. I do not believe there's a precedent for a team of investigators going in at such a short time after an incident was alleged to have occurred and actually talking to firsthand to people who were affected and actually seeing the effects on the people who lived in that area. Mm-hmm. And those were two different areas. It was in East and West Ghouta, which is at different ends of Damascus, as you know, in the suburbs. It's like diametrically opposite. So this is the first time that you actually had an investigation of such an incident such a short time afterwards. It's never happened before that I can recall.
And yet we see such a major discrepancy in the findings following from the environmental and human samples. Can I ask you one more question, and something that attracted my attention? There have been a lot of reports about a huge death toll from this now confirmed use of sarin, according to the United Nations. But what I noticed in the UN report is that there is absolutely no mentioning of examining any dead bodies, and yet we heard a lot of stories about death toll being up to 1,800 people. Why was it? Was it because you had no time, or simply because you didn't find that important, or maybe you didn't have access to dead bodies? Because certainly dead bodies would have presented you with an
Roxana,
interesting
let me correct something.
Mm-hmm.
We have never, in the United Nations, we have never advanced the death toll. The death toll numbers come from various non-governmental organizations. We in the United Nations have never advanced a death toll number. We do not have any numbers. We do not know how many people died.
I didn't mean to actually imply that. What I was really asking you is whether or not your team has requested any access to dead bodies, because surely we know that there was some death toll. Have your colleagues seen any bodies in either West or East Ghouta? Have you been able to collect samples from some dead tissues and so on?
No, they didn't, and I tell you why. Because there were so many victims who were still alive that there was really no need to exhume bodies and basically take tissue from them. For we had also complete case history, meaning that the victims were able to tell how they were affected, what they felt, what the symptoms were, which is much more powerful than taking tissue from a body.
But were you told that all the bodies have already been buried at that point of time? Because this is obviously a very crucial and political point, that since your team was the only one who had access to that area, this was something that was very important to understand the actualities of that attack.
Well, I don't agree with you, Oksana, because, as I said, a dead body can't tell you anything, can't tell you how the person died, can't tell you how the person was affected, how the person suffered. A living person can tell you that, and that's the case history that is basically very well documented, and that's also preserved. And we did not ask for bodies to be exhumed. We assumed that they had been buried simply because that's a Muslim tradition to bury people very quickly. And as I mentioned, it was extremely hot at the time that we were in Damascus. But at the time when there are so many victims who are alive who can tell the story that goes with the samples and the tissues that they took, there's no need to exhume any bodies.
Well, Ms. Kane, I have to contradict you. My very limited knowledge of medical science tells me that autopsies are generally considered a much more comprehensive source of information, both on the cause of death and what the body may have been exposed to prior to death than some individual blood or urine samples. But we have to take a short break now. When we come back, the Syrian conflict was born out of geopolitics and fueled by it. But can it really be resolved through a political solution? That's coming up in a few moments on Worlds Apart. Welcome back to Worlds Apart, where we are discussing Syrian chemical disarmament with Angela Kane, the UN High Representative for Disarmament Affairs. Ms. Kane, you've been with the United Nations for so long, and I know that in one of your previous capacities, you served as the Assistant Secretary for Political Affairs, dealing with all sorts of conflicts in Palestine, Iraq, Nepal, and clearly politics plays a very important role in any conflict. But I wonder, given your experience, how would you rate Syria in terms of politics, international politics, affecting conflict resolution both negatively and positively?
I think what has happened is that the Syrian conflict has gone on very long. It's gone on for 2.5 years. I think a lot of people have died. We just talked about the chemical weapons and the victims, but I think we forget the magnitude of how many people have been killed by conventional weapons. It's over 100,000. I think the latest figure now is 110,000. The Syrian conflict has created millions of refugees, 2.5 million refugees in neighboring countries, which has put a tremendous strain not only on the people in Syria, but also on the neighboring countries. And I must say also on the world community, because the world community has largely assisted also the humanitarian effort to help sustain the people who are in camps, to help sustain the countries that have been host countries to the refugees. And the sheer numbers have really overwhelmed the region. And so there was a great impatience about trying to come to a political solution. And that has been a very difficult effort. How do you come to a political solution? I think in the end, it all comes down to an agreement among major powers, to an agreement among member states, to an agreement by Syria, a sovereign country, a member of the United Nations. And I'm very encouraged that just in the last 3 weeks, there has been a resurgence of effort around this issue. And that started actually with the agreement also in Geneva between the Russian Federation and the United States. It started with the accession of Syria to the Chemical Weapons Convention, and it started with a new momentum towards a political solution. So you've basically got 3 pillars, and the 3 pillars are chemical weapons 1, the second is the political solution, and of course the humanitarian solution.
Now, it also has to involve the Syrian opposition, and in order to conduct your investigation on the ground, you had to maintain certain contacts with the militarized opposition. I wonder, how did you go about it logistically? Did you have to rely on any of the UN members to help open those channels of communication with the opposition?
What happened was that, as you know, we have a country team, a UN country team in Syria. The country team is located in Damascus. They also have some outlying offices. They are providing humanitarian aid. And obviously, we have a contingent there of security officers. And they basically helped us because they have obviously contacts, because you can't move around. If you want to distribute humanitarian supplies, if you want to do any work at all in Syria these days, you have to also have contacts with the opposition. So we had help from the country team that is in Damascus, and that was very much welcome.
Now, those contacts with the opposition will be probably even more crucial during the disarmament stage, because ensuring that cooperation would be something extremely important. I think there is a certain presumption within Western political community that it is now Russia's responsibility to make sure that Syria cooperates with both your office, the United Nations in general, and other organizations. Is there a similar presumption that those countries who support the opposition now have to provide a similar level of cooperation on the part of the rebels?
Oksana, I think that the overlying principle here is that we all want to make it happen. We all want to make sure that chemical weapons are no longer existent in Syria and that they're being destroyed. And I think everyone has to pull along the same vein. We're doing our bit together with the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. We're supporting their inspectors going in. But I must say that I don't think there's any one country or any 2 countries or any 5 countries that are being looked to have a special responsibility. If you look at the resolution and the Executive Council decision of the OPCW, you will see that it is actually Syria who is being told, you have to be responsible for ensuring the security, you have to be responsible for destroying the chemical weapons. And so that's basically the obligation that's laid down when you accede to the Chemical Weapon Convention. Now, we know already that Syria is having great problems and cannot destroy actually the chemical weapons. But on the other hand, there will have to be some multilateral assistance or help from major countries. But how that is going to work, we don't know yet.
Well, Ms. Kane, the reason I ask this question is because it's sometimes difficult to tell the difference between disarmament as a technological or technical goal and disarmament as a political goal. And I think it's easy to see why some countries would be in favor of technological disarmament, the President Assad physically doing away with its stockpiles, but they may be not so excited about that politically, fearing that that would empower his regime. So the possibility of a conflict of interest is there. Now, you are somebody who is concerned with disarmament as being the ultimate objective. And let me ask you specifically, do you think it is the sole responsibility of Syria? Is Syria the only party that is responsible for making sure that this disarmament initiative is indeed successful?
According to the Chemical Weapons Convention, yes, it is. According to reality and to practicalities, we know that it cannot be. So there is an effort by other member states to help the effort along. And if you look at the Security Council resolution, it asks the Secretary General, in consultation with the Director General of OPCW, to make recommendations to the Security Council by next Monday. And then the Security Council will decide on exactly what will be the mandate. There are questions that are as yet unanswered. Syria has made a declaration of their chemical weapons holdings or stockpiles, mixing equipments, etc. That needs to be verified by the inspectors. They will have to be accompanied by security. There have to be a logistics effort. Then they will start the process of how do we actually destroy what's there and with whose help will that be done. And I think that's just a huge effort. And I would not say that that's political. Political objective is to get rid of the chemical weapons. And we will need the help of member states. It cannot be really all done by a joint UN OPCW effort.
I've heard you being asked several times of how your office and the Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons can ensure that Syria actually complies with the timetable that is being set and with the the plan of action that it will be presented with. And I know that you said in the past that as of now there is no mechanism, but let me turn that question around a little bit and ask you whether there is indeed a mechanism to ensure that Syria is indeed treated fairly and that indeed if it complies with all the obligations but for some reason misses the very ambitious deadline, which is the mid of 2014, and if that happens for reasons that are beyond the control of the Syrian government, and at this point we have to admit there are a lot of unknowns associated with funding, expertise, security, and so on. So if indeed Syria misses that deadline, and again we hear calls of punishing this country for non-compliance, will you be able to stand up and defend the disarmament process, not the Assad government, but the progress that hopefully will be done in this direction?
I think, Oksana, anyone who looks at those timelines knows that they are extremely ambitious. And these timelines were established without knowing exactly what Syria would declare in terms of the stockpiles. But on the other hand, there's another aspect to that, and it's extremely costly. And let me remind you that while these timelines were set, I think when you look at, for example, the Russian Federation and the United States, both of these countries had timelines that were established under the Chemical Weapons Conventions. And both of these deadlines were extended simply because it was physically impossible to destroy the material in that time.
But do I understand you correctly that as things stand now, it is highly possible that Syria may indeed miss the set deadline, even if it puts its best efforts into this initiative?
I can't comment on that. I hope it will be applied. I hope it will be adhered to. I can't comment on that because that's speculation into the future. All I can say is that I think everyone realizes it's ambitious.
Now, as we discussed, there is now a new team of experts on the ground who are now tasked with destroying the production capabilities of the Assad government to actually make those chemical weapons. And I know that this task is primarily handled by the organization in The Hague, but since you are bound by the cooperation agreement with them, let me ask you this question. I've read in some media reports that at this point of time, it's essentially something that requires a brute force, just using sledgehammers to destroy some of the machinery, destroying some of the empty shells and so on. Is it as simple as that?
Let me correct one misunderstanding first. The OPCW is not tasked with destroying the chemical weapon stockpiles. The OPCW is tasked with verifying the destruction, but they're also tasked with helping Syria draw up a timeline and a possibility how best to destroy. So they give advice, but they don't actually carry out the work themselves. And the OPCW has a cooperation agreement. It is not part of the United Nations, but there is a cooperation agreement that was concluded in 2001. So we do have a very good collaboration. And I'm very happy to see that this is continuing with this current effort where we provide a lot of the logistics and the security and some other services for the mission of the inspectors to verify the stockpiles.
So do I understand you correctly that at this point no disarmament process per se has started yet?
Has not. They have just started to deploy, and I believe they will start the inspection of the sites. I think it's the 7th or the 8th of October, so that'll be early next week.
Well, it indeed looks like a colossal task, but the feeling here in Moscow and probably over there in New York at the UN headquarters that it could be done despite all odds if, of course, a genuine political will exists. Well, Angela Kane, the UN High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, thank you very much for your time. And to our viewers, please join us again, same place, same time, here on Worlds Apart.